And to deliver the lecture today, we have Professor Charles Upchurch, who's come rather a long way, all the way from the USA. Charles Upchurch received his PhD in modern British history from Rutgers University in 2003. His research focuses on 19th century British gender and social history, and his teaching fields include modern Britain, the British Empire, modern Europe, gender history, and the history of sexuality. His book, Before Wild, Sex Between Men in Britain's Age of Reform, published by the University of California Press in 2009, explores the ways in which class influenced the interpretation of same-sex desire in the period when the British state first began to police sex between men on a regular basis. It is the first work to call attention to the widespread reporting of court cases related to sex between men in mainstream London newspapers between 1820 and 1870. It also places family reactions at the centre of the narrative, in order to better understand how these acts were understood within a broader culture. Professor Upchurch's current book project investigates a group of men in the British Parliament who were working to reduce the penalties for homosexual acts in the early 19th century. Okay, everybody, may I present Professor Charles Upchurch.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Sue and Jeff for doing so much work to put this together and everyone else involved in the festival. And I wanted to say right from the start that I'm really honored to present this research as the first Alan Horsfall Lecture. Now, in part because this work emphasizes the importance of the links between political activism and identity, a connection that was central to Alan's life and work. Now, normally both of these concepts aren't associated with the 1820s and the 1830s, right? Activism and political identity. But I hope by the end of my talk here today, I'll have shown you why that really should not be the case. Now, part of what I'm presenting comes from new research and new discoveries, but other elements are already familiar in one form or another to some of you. Events that were too significant in their own day to have ever been entirely forgotten, or ones that were more recently recovered by the research of other scholars and other activists. But most of these elements have only been analyzed individually and have not been seen as part of a broader story. Now, this is in part because it took a great deal of effort to retrieve each one of these separate elements from all of the methods used to hide or deny homosexual acts in history. The events take on a much greater significance, though, when placed in their proper relationship to one another. And now, to be sure, there are still significant gaps in the evidence, and many of the connections are still needing to be strengthened. Nevertheless, there is enough that's been recovered to put forward a new argument that can establish a role for both identity, in this case, the conviction by key men at the center of these events that their sexual feelings for other men were both inborn and natural, and political activism, and in this case, the lobbying of parliamentarians for reform of the sodomy laws for at least a handful of individuals in the early 19th century. This talk will both sketch the story from the fragmentary evidence that survives and speculate on the degree to which this new evidence might change the way we interpret the less explicit but much more plentiful information on sex between men in the period. The place to begin to see the impact and the importance and the significance of what's occurring is with the events of the summer of 1825. Now, the summer of 1825 is currently not on the list of significant watersheds in the history of sexuality in Britain, but it should be. By the end of the summer of 1825, 3 members of Parliament had been brought down by scandals involving homosexual acts in the space of only 5 months. One of them, MP Richard Heber, fled England for the continent in late July 1825 on the eve of an accusation of homosexual acts being made publicly against him. Now, evidence survives in the letters of Robert Peel of him personally intervening to ensure that Heber resigned from Parliament and that he stayed on the continent and did not return to the country in the midst of the fallout from these events. He got an intermediary to send the letters back and forth. He was very careful not to be personally associated, but nevertheless, you can retrace it and retrack it. In addition to Heber, right, another MP, James Stanhope, committed suicide in late March 1825 under the suspicion of homosexual acts. A third MP, Henry Gray Bennett, was publicly accused in print of homosexual acts in August 1825 and disappeared from Parliament and political life shortly thereafter. No fewer than 9 separate magistrates are recorded in the London Times alone, and many other newspapers as well, commenting on the unusual increase in cases related to sex between men that were appearing before them in the courts in the summer of 1825. Men previously acting with impunity in their pursuit of other men for sex were also put on trial in this year, including John Grosset Murhead, vice president of the Auxiliary Bible Society, no less, and also, too, the brother-in-law of the Duke of Athol. He was put on trial in August of 1825. Now, according to witnesses, Murhead, he's such a character, he had been known in one neighborhood for over 20 years as someone who used his economic advantage and social position to seduce other men for sex. A separate raid on a Molly house also was reported on exactly the same day that news of the Murhead arrest broke. That said, by far the vast majority of all of these cases that are popping up in the summer of 1825 are for cases involving 2 men in public space, sometimes private space, and the encounters between them, the arrested for this, as well as some extortions that were based on this. So, when measured against the norms for the prosecution of homosexual behavior for the whole of the 19th century, which we can now do with confidence thanks to the work of so many researchers, it's safe to say that something extraordinarily unusual is occurring in the summer of 1825. In the process of identifying what exactly it was, though, it's first helpful to answer and ask the question of why then in particular. And the answer is because there was a change in the law, shepherded through Parliament by Robert Peel personally, with March 1825 being a very central moment in this for the debates in Parliament over this act. It was sparked by events that began 3 years before with the scandal surrounding the arrest of the Bishop of Clower and the subsequent suicide of Viscount Castlereagh. Now, it was a result of Peel's actions in 1825 that a remarkable, impassioned plea for the acceptance, the acceptability of homosexual acts based on the natural and inborn nature of the feelings that sparked those acts, that this was written, and which has survived, despite all odds, down to the present day. Now, before getting to that remarkable document, though, let's begin with the circumstances that produced it. Now, few markers in the history of sexuality for the early 19th century in Britain are as familiar to some individuals as the Bishop of Clower affair. Now, as the story is usually told, in 1822, a bishop in the Church of Ireland, Percy Jocelyn, was arrested after being caught in a sexual act in a London public house with a soldier. Now, public opinion was outraged by the event, especially when the bishop was allowed to post a bail of £1,000, which, while a lot at the time, was a minuscule amount for a man of his fortune. And he was allowed to escape justice. Meanwhile, the common soldier who he was arrested with had to face prosecution for the acts. So angry stories circulated in the streets, filled the newspapers denouncing the bishop, and in the following days, clergymen found themselves taunted in the streets of London, with the private secretary to the Home Secretary remarking that no event in the past 100 years had done more to damage the system of deference binding the upper and the lower social orders, right? And of course, the French Revolution was less than a generation away, so, that's saying something. The scandal made enough of an impact and enough of an impression that 20 years later, in the 1840s, the former bishop's obituary was printed in newspapers across Britain, right? People wanted to know what had happened to this individual. 20 years after the case, explaining what had happened to him right since his 1822 disappearance. These details of the bishop's case have been recounted by multiple secondary works since the 1970s, though. And I myself purposely left the bishop out of my first book, thinking that one more retelling of these events was unnecessary, because I, at the time, assumed, like pretty much everybody before me, that while this scandal was sensational in the moment, it had really little in the way of lasting consequences. Now, the bishop's case did have lasting consequences, though, and not so much because, and we've forgotten this, not so much because the way it was remembered was wrong, but rather it was just radically oversimplified. Now, it was enough in the 1970s when this story was first recovered simply to recover the story, to tell it, to get it on the record. But now, right, with newer tools, right, when we're looking at it at a different level, and when you examine it in greater detail and with attention to the sequence of events, we can see that the incident was an important moment for bringing about more widespread attention to cases involving homosexual acts, and especially those involving very prominent men, elite men within British society. Now, this is because the incident demonstrated the unacceptable consequences for the respectable press of not publishing cases involving sex between men, even though they were very reluctant to do so, and especially with high-placed men. Now, that's because 11 years before, the bishop had been accused of similar acts by a coachman in Ireland. And then the press had refrained from publishing any information damaging to the bishop. Just as the respectable press had initially refused to publish information identifying Percy Jocelyn after his 1822 arrest. But the deference previously shown to the bishop had allowed him to persecute his accuser in Ireland, James Byrne, the coachman, to have him imprisoned for false accusation, to have him flogged, and after the first flogging, when, quote, he was bled and tortured until the last spark of life and feeling had nearly become extinct in him, close quote, he was pressured to recant his accusation on the promise that further floggings would not follow. But even then, quote, he did not yield until the repeated menaces of the utter destruction of his wife and 4 children who were brought to the dungeon threw themselves at his knees and actually wept him into acquiescence, close quote, right? Now, the first report of the 1822 Bishop of Clower incident in July 1825, almost a week after the initial arrest, in the Times, what stated, quote, an exposure of the most monstrous depravity has taken place within these past few days, all allusion to which we have hitherto suppressed, end quote. But it was the plight of James Byrne that made this story impossible to ignore. And most all of the coverage, and this is one of the things that have been missed, it's not really about the bishop and the soldier, but it's about James Byrne. When James Byrne's story became known in London, and William Cobbett was the one that brought it over, that's what broke the logjam of publication on this. The next day's paper in the Times, and really all of the respectable press by this point, described Byrne as, quote, the poor victim of this audacious hypocrite who was unrelentingly flogged after the bishop had him prosecuted, and the report faulted, and, quote, the state itself, through whose erring tribunals an innocent man was tortured, and the guilty left and enabled to triumph over him, end quote. Now, these were the details that constituted the first substantial reports in the liberal press on the Bishop of Clower incident, with the liberal and radical press now almost equal in their expressions of outrage. The Times was still reluctant to publish details of cases involving sex between men, but now it was clear that to not do so could create the circumstances where innocent individuals might be wrongly convicted or even tortured, as James Byrne was. The liberal press, following the principle of bringing the light of public opinion to cases from this, bringing the light of public opinion to the workings of the state to correct injustice, right, provided far more systematic coverage of these cases from this point forward, including cases involving men of high social status. Radical politicians, for their part, seized on the Byrne story, and when it was discovered that he was alive in Ireland, he was brought to London and given a hero's welcome. William Cobbett, right, one of the leading radical politicians of the day, presided over London banquets given in Byrne's honor, attended by over 200 individuals. A public subscription was also set up for Byrne, raising £300 to compensate him. Now, just as Cobbett had done years before with the bones of Tom Paine, James Byrne's name became a metonym that could quickly bring to mind a powerful criticism of upper-class corruption. Advertisements for the banquets and subscriptions kept Byrne's name and his story before the public for years, holding him up as an emblematic example of the abuse of upper-class power made possible by an unreformed parliament in the 1820s, right? So this was real politics at the time. As late as 1826, William Cobbett and Henry Hunt, orator Henry Hunt, the prominent working class radical who was the key speaker in the 1819 rally that witnessed the Peterloo Massacre right here in Manchester, they sued one another over a dispute stemming from their mutual support of James Byrne and his cause, right? So very central to these constitutional issues and attempts at constitutional reform in the 1820s. Now, it's within this charged atmosphere of late July and early August 1822, with the breakdown of the deference of the press at all levels to not discuss the allegations of homosexual activity made against elite men, that we need to consider the next main element of this story, and one that gets us a step closer to the parliamentary activity that's at the center of this narrative. And that's the suicide of Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh. Now, Castlereagh, who negotiated the peace treaty for Britain at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, who was instrumental in gaining Wellington the commission in the Peninsular Campaign, and who was Foreign Secretary and leader of the House of Commons from 1812 to 1822, Castlereagh took his own life just a few weeks after the Bishop of Clower incident. Now, the most common explanation for the Castlereagh suicide was that he was delusional due to overwork, exhaustion, and the pressures of government. But many of his increasingly paranoid statements in the final days of his life included repeated confessions that he was being blackmailed for committing homosexual acts. Now, the issue was first directly investigated in 1959 by Montgomery Hyde in The Strange Death of Lord Castlereagh. Hyde's conclusion that Castlereagh did have a chance encounter with a cross-dressed man that he thought was a woman, but that this happened in public space and did not result in physical contact, has been cited and repeated ever since. Hyde's level of research is impressive, yet his archival access was facilitated by the fact that he was a close friend of the Londonderry family, right, the Castlereagh family. And he was employed by them at the time that he wrote the book. Yeah, really. And yet everyone's quoted this ever since, right? The story of the cross-dressed prostitute comes from only one piece of evidence based on a statement of a trusted family friend, or a trusted friend of Castlereagh himself, that was not written until 3 decades after the actual suicide. And it does not fit well at all with Castlereagh's own statements or the other evidence from the period. Castlereagh's own statements indicate that he was being blackmailed for an incident that occurred in 1819, that he was guilty of the same crime as the Bishop of Clower, and that he made these confessions to King George IV as well as other members of the cabinet, including Peel. Those confessions occurred in the 3-week period between when the liberal and radical press began publishing the bishop's story and when Castlereagh took his own life, and not before, right in that very tight window. It is now one interpretation of the remaining evidence, right, at least as well supported as Hyde's account, is that Castlereagh had been blackmailed since 1819, but that the situation was no longer manageable after the radicalization of the atmosphere stemming from the Bishop of Clower incident. Now, regardless of the nature of the incident that led to the blackmail, in my book we'll talk a little bit more about this, though, what is beyond dispute is that Robert Peel and King George IV were informed by a cabinet minister, Castlereagh, that blackmailers sending threatening letters containing accusations of homosexual activity had attempted to compromise the cabinet. And as soon as he could do something about it, Robert Peel acted to make sure that this would not happen again in the same way. Castlereagh's suicide occurred just a few days after the end of the 1822 parliamentary session. In the very next session, in 1823, Robert Peel shepherded through Parliament the Threatening Letters Act, which would provide propertied men greater tools to prosecute men who accused them of unnatural crimes, addressing exactly the situation that Castlereagh had found himself in. In one of the first cases to be tried under the law, however, the wording of the Threatening Letters Act was found to be inadequate. The conviction of Thomas Hickman was overturned by a panel of London judges on the grounds that attempted sodomy, of which Hickman had accused his landlord in a letter, that was not an infamous crime, and therefore not prosecutable under the 1823 Act. Sodomy itself was an infamous crime, but attempted sodomy was only a misdemeanor. And so therefore, right, they pay attention. Their technicalities really count. Right, and therefore any letter accusing another man of making a sexual advance that fell short of sodomy did not fall within the scope of the Threatening Letters Act. And I think this is why nobody's connected these dots before too, because the 25 event is so far removed from the suicide, but it's because people have missed this bit in the middle that I'm giving you right now. Now, because of this judicial decision, Peel put forward an amendment to the Threatening Letters Act in the subsequent parliamentary session, restoring his intent for the law by adding a clause to the legislation that dramatically increased the actions related to sex between men that were defined as infamous crime. So he expanded the category rather than just fixing that particular piece of legislation. Now, the amendment to the 1823 Act now made not just sodomy itself, but, quote, every assault with intent to commit, every attempt or endeavor to commit, and every solicitation, persuasion, promise, or threat, right? So even discussing, right? Even just a touch or even just suggesting is enough to potentially start a court case. And all of this was now an infamous crime. And it was this expanded definition of infamous crime that was later incorporated into Peel's consolidation of the English Criminal Law Code starting in 1828. Peel's speech, where he put forward the amendment to the Threatening Letters Act, was in March 1825. Just a few days before, N.P. James Stanhope, mentioned at the start of this talk, committed suicide. Now, there is a remarkable document that records the parliamentary debate where the 1825 amendment to the Threatening Letters Act was passed, written by an individual who, based on the evidence within the document, almost certainly was in the House of Commons at the time, who strongly identified with his feelings of same-sex desire, and who considered such feelings to be natural, and who spoke for a group of similar men. The document has been discussed by academics since 1957, known primarily to Byron scholars as the 50-page poem Don Leon. Now, because the change in the law regarding homosexual acts that Peel brought about in 1825 was forgotten by 20th century academics and scholars and overshadowed by the legal reforms of 1828, the poem has been misdated. Most scholars follow the work of Lewis Crompton, dating the main body of the poem from 1833, with subsequent updates by others. Now, this is plausible as a conclusion if the 1823 and 1825 legislation is unknown, but it's also perhaps why so little has been made of the political narrative that can be seen as embedded within the poem until now. Because if you're trying to align the discussion of the poem with specific political events from 1833 or later, it just simply doesn't work. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But all of the political actors and actions mentioned align with the 1825 session, right, and not any other. Many Byron scholars and literary critics have analyzed Don Leon, attempting to determine its author by the poem's style, content, and the extraordinary endnotes appended to the end of the poem, where for over 50 additional pages, multiple contributors draw on stories from newspapers, from literature, from history, and from other sources to bolster the argument for the acceptance of homosexual desire and discuss the potential for legal reform in Britain. Now, among the best discussions of the poem is that by Lewis Crompton. He's done great work on this, who argues that the majority of the poem was the work of one author, which I very much agree with, and that the notes were written by multiple hands in the years 1833, 1842, and in the late 1850s, also to, I think, an accurate analysis. The political narrative of the poem is of crucial importance since there was a real possibility in the 1820s in England of eliminating the death penalty for sodomy. Now, legal codes throughout Europe had been revised and rationalized over the previous 2 generations, resulting in the elimination of the death penalty for a whole host of crimes, including sodomy, in Tuscany, Austria, Prussia, Russia. Right? Sex between men was still punished with lesser penalties using other statutes, with the elimination of the death penalty being not so much a sign of greater tolerance for these acts, but as an attempt to better align the severity of the punishment to the nature of the infraction in keeping with Enlightenment-inspired legal reforms. Similar appeals to the Enlightenment tradition were used to remove the sodomy laws in France under the Napoleonic legal code, and subsequently this was adopted by multiple European states. Now, no similar reform of the whole of the English criminal code had been carried out in Britain before the 1820s. Yet there were many lobbying for just such a reform at the time, and there were many who were sure that it was imminent in the decade before it actually commenced, in the late 1820s. It would not have been possible in this period to stand on the floor of the House of Commons and speak about the injustice of the sodomy law, though. Whenever the laws relating to sex between men were discussed in the British Parliament in the whole of the 19th century, they were almost always paired with another piece of legislation so that any debate could be presented as related to that other issue, right? Which makes there some interesting debates, right, when they're trying to play it off as something else. But it might have been possible by lobbying from inside of the unreformed Parliament to have the death penalty quietly dropped as a punishment as part of a larger criminal law reform act. And Don Leon records one document that argued for exactly such a reform. Now, that document does not survive, but fragments of evidence related to it are preserved in Don Leon and one other source. It was titled A Free Examination into the Penal Statutes, 25 Henry VIII, 5 Elizabeth, i.e. the sodomy laws, and it was addressed to both houses of Parliament. The fragments indicate that the contents were similar to Jeremy Bentham's unpublished arguments against the sodomy laws, written in 1774, 1785, and 1814 to 1816. They also preserve evidence that the work was written and endorsed by a collective of individuals. When the religious injunction against sex between men was discussed in a free examination, it's noted that, quote, a verse or two, worded so vaguely that they would be impossible to cite as an authority in a book of legal precedents, are made to decide upon our very existence and destiny, right? Our existence and destiny. When the Greek acceptance of certain forms of same-sex desire is discussed, a free examination is cited indicating that, quote, in a Greek grammar, for instance, there are some golden rules for youth presented, showing that the thing, sex between men, was at least spoken of familiarly in a familiar way before young persons, and seems to have forbidden with about the same strain that we are accustomed to hearing fornication forbidden today, and probably with about the same effect, end quote. Right. Another long quote from a free examination relating to the ancient world. It is lamented that the modern authors mention anti-physical pleasures if they only related to certain individuals, right? They only do so in relation to, quote, the vices of a Tiberius, a Nero, or a Caligula, endeavoring to disguise or conceal from their readers this important truth, that the virtuous, the brave, the generous, the temperate have equally sympathized with the same predilection, end quote. Neither a free examination nor Don Leon is an argument for exclusive homosexual desire, though. Another part of the poem, Don Leon, quotes a free examination to argue, quote, it does not follow as a natural consequence that pederasts are misogynists, and that the indulgence in the inclinations for one sex argues for an insensibility to the charms of another, end quote. After more elaboration on this point, the author indicates that this remark was taken from a free examination, a book which we recommend all persons to peruse, end quote. At this point, the author of this portion of Don Leon is speaking directly to the reader, and he is speaking for a group, just as the author of A Free Examination did, as previously quoted. Now, finally, when indicating what the modern punishment for sex between men should more fairly, more rightly be, A Free Examination relates two incidents that were reported in French newspapers. They involve, respectively, a marquis and another more humble individual, each charged with making sexual advances on different gendarmes in different parts of the city. Now, the nobleman, which you find a lot in the 19th century British records, so too, of course, the nobleman was given a fine and laughed out of court, while the humbler man spent 2 weeks in jail. After relating this evidence, the author asks, quote, will Mr. Peel please say that this is not better than death warrants and gibbets, not to mention the distress of innocent families rendered miserable forever, end quote. Now, if the evidence of a free examination in Don Leon is only fragmentary, the poem itself records in its entirety an early 19th century journey of self-discovery related to sexuality and centrally to same-sex desire. In the account, the author repeatedly refers to what he describes as inborn passions and his love for other men. When narrating his childhood, the author states that he was attracted to beauty of both sexes in his early teens and that he remained this way as a man. He would feel strongly for other boys, but he did not act on these feelings and remained innocent. He also could not explain these feelings then, although he and another boy might lay together, little else happened on these occasions. The author also presents the idea that these teenage feelings were already set in his character, but hidden, as if written in sympathetic ink, meaning invisible ink, and only becoming intelligible with time and experience. Now, this is quoting the poem. Thus passed my boyhood, and though proofs were none, what path my future course in life would run. Like sympathetic ink, if then unclear, the test applied soon made the trace appear. Right? So this is already written in his character, but only becomes apparent as he gets older. Now, it is significant that all of these youthful experiences were represented as with individuals of roughly his own age. While at university, he became infatuated with several slightly younger men, one in particular who was of a lesser class background. He was aware of the laws against such passions, and he began reading to find justifications for his love. He discovered the poets and philosophers, including Plato and Socrates and Bion of Smyrna and Plutarch and Horace, and the Theban general and statesman who broke Thebes from Sparta's control, and the male lover who was buried with him. Don Leon, the poet of Don Leon, ends this section by arguing that human nature is the same then as now, and then cites Shakespeare's sonnets, among other texts, as evidence for the persistence of same-sex desire among learned Englishmen well into the Christian era. The author's argument is not that he is exclusively homosexual, but rather it is the strict embargo, and that's a quote, on these feelings that warps us, right? The strict embargo that warps us. At one point in Don Leon, the author writes that he hopes to find his own modern-day Phaedrus, and he continues on to say that God gives every man at birth a stamp, and lists the many men who have had such feelings similar to his. But this argument for tolerance and recognition was overwhelmed by the events of the summer of 1825, stemming from Peel's change in the law. The poem captures this moment when the poet writes, "O Peel, for this nefarious deed alone, do what thou wilt, thou never can atone. Why blow the bubble of thine own repute for laws amended, but on this be mute? Mute? No, not mute, for heretofore there lay a stumbling block in every jury's way, but Draco-like, thou, gainsay who can, did add a clause to sink the drowning man. Why were the listening commons silent then? Martin has mercy, yes, for beasts, but not men. And Brogden's modesty his voice impedes, who, when the sections of the bill he reads, with verse of Connie's to gentle hush, subdues his tone and feigns a maiden's blush. But answer Mackintosh, were thou asleep, or was the tide of thy feeling also at its neap?" Now, here the poem is chastising men in Parliament, known for championing humanitarian causes, for not arguing against Peel's successful effort to add a clause to sink the drowning man. Now, all of the individuals cited above are readily identifiable. And Martin, Colonel Richard Martin, Irish politician and strong campaigner against cruelty to animals, he was no longer an MP after 1826. For these and other reasons shown in my upcoming book, Don Leon is much more of an insider's critique of these events than is currently understood, and it is far more accurate in the details that it provides. MP William Banks was also mentioned in this section of the poem, and although he was not publicly accused of homosexual acts in 1825, he was later involved in such scandals, weathering one in 1833 before being forced to flee the country, and a second public accusation and series of scandals that happened in 1841. The summer of 1825 seems to be one of the climactic moments in a series of events that begins in 1822 with the arrest and prosecution of the Bishop of Clower. This caused a political firestorm fanned by radical politicians who used it as an example of upper-class corruption and unequal justice. This political crisis was exploited especially by William Cobbett, one of the leading radical politicians of the day, and helped to precipitate the Castlereagh suicide. This in turn led to Peel's more draconian policies toward the policing of sex between men and destroyed the protected space within which a small group of elite men within the Parliament had worked to quietly eliminate the death penalty for sodomy. This small group of MPs were all highly educated, identified to some degree with their feelings of same-sex desire, and came from a position of privilege that made them believe that they might effect such a change in the unreformed Parliament. Remnants of this group remained after the crisis of 1825, making efforts to pursue legal reform again in the early 1830s and again in the early 1840s, but in both cases to no effect. Don Leon seems to have been first written as a lament to the crisis of the summer of 1825, written by one of them and updated by others in subsequent years from exile on the continent where the laws were more tolerant. Now, this narrative just presented is based on evidence found shattered in fragments. As Paige Dubois skillfully explored in her book, Sappho is Burning, what is the desire of the scholar when confronted by fragments? How can scholars think again about our will to make broken material evidence of a whole past? Now, a liberationist version of gay history could be confirmed by a certain reading of this material. And while it's important not to uncritically embrace that possibility, it is also important not to unnecessarily dismiss it. Queer methodologies, as well as Anna Clark's historical analysis of the diaries of Anne Lister, remind us, among other things, that any identity articulated in Don Leon may not have extended beyond the author himself or his colleagues, and also makes us alert to the ways in which such understandings were unique to specific times and places. Yet to not pursue the possibility of the broadest implications of this material seems to collude with those who worked to ensure that most of the evidence that might verify or refute this story presented here today would never be written down, or that if it were written down, then it would be destroyed by family or friends or institutions, and that if it could not be destroyed, then it was denied, minimized, misfiled, unindexed, or dismissed as trivial or lascivious. If to too quickly embrace the disruptive potential of the evidence of identity and political activism preserved in these sources for the 1820s is not rigorous scholarship, then to too quickly assume that we know what can and cannot be present is at least as problematic. If caution is called for when moving forward, so too, I think, is a bit of sympathetic ink. All right, thank you very much.
A massive thank you, Charles, for that fascinating insight into early 19th century homosexuality in Britain.